So we're going to have a thematic discussion on racism and hate speech, the racist hate speech and its implications. Sociologist Ferhat Kentel is going to take the floor first, and he is from Istanbul Bilgi University Sociology Department, from Marmara University Sociology Department, and he worked in those departments as a lecturer. He worked on discrimination, new social movements, daily life, and daily sociological movements. He wrote many books, and among those books, we can count Armenians in Turkey, as a member of the community and citizen, etc., etc. Now the floor is yours, Mr. Ferhat Kentel. Hello, everyone. Let me first of all extend my greetings to those who organized this beautiful event, to Hrant Dink Foundation. The title of today's session is Racism and Hate Speech, Racist Hate Speech and its Implications, to be more precise. In popularism, racism has become mainstream almost. It's become normalized, and it's turned into something different. And this issue, which affected large masses, should be analyzed more in depth, and it requires great efforts. And hopefully during this session, we will open up new horizons in our minds. We have very valuable two speakers. First of all, Ms. Kemal Yıldız, and then we will give the floor to Ezgi Güner. But let me introduce to you Ümit Kemal Yıldız. He is a lecturer in Manchester University. He worked in prison training programs and active citizenship training programs for active citizenship, and he specialized in those topics and made many studies on the topics. And he is anti-racist and an activist in the labor union. And he has social activities besides his academic work on the subject as well. And in the college union of the university, he was elected to the Black Students' Union. And probably what he has to tell us will be very important and very informative for us. He's going to be discussing fundamental British values and the perfect racism. Ümit Bey, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Hrant Dink Foundation for organizing this event. I think it is very timely, and it is really important period of his history we are going through. So before I start talking about fundamental British values, I'd like to say a few things about what we have been doing in Bradford as an activist. I want to share a few photos here because I think the state murder of George Floyd in the USA is a highlighted really important issue. The racism is alive and alive, and we have to keep fighting back against racism. And the mass demonstrations across the world gave us boost to some confidence for the anti-racist campaign and fight back. These photos are from my hometown here, where I live in Bradford. We organized 3 big demos, and hundreds of people came and they united against racism. And I think is that we need to remind ourselves that we are many, and anti-racists are many, and the racists are few. But in order to show this strength, we need to be out there and fighting against and campaign against racism. And the one placard has really touched me in this demonstration. I think it shows the international perspective aspect of this Black Lives Matter demonstrations as well. And my research and this talk is a very small contribution to this ongoing anti-racist, anti-fascist struggle. And I hope I will raise a few questions amongst listeners here. And well, I hope we will have a good discussion. So just to talk about the fundamental British values, the themes and ideas I am going to share with you today are emerged from my interviews with 46 young people from schools and colleges in the north of England, addressing fundamental British values and what they mean for them. The title of this talk is suggested by one of the participants, and it was her description of fundamental British values. Although I conducted this research in England, it is framed in a wider international political, social, and economic context. In this talk, I'm not going to discuss about whether the identified values are British values or human values or world values, but what I am going to argue here, the notion of fundamental British values is a racist notion, which is part of a wider political agenda. It is part of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim discourse. Now, let's see what they are, what fundamental British values are. Fundamental British values identified as democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance of different faith and beliefs. I mean, some of you might say now, Ümit, are you a crazy person? How dare you can say democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty are racist, which we are going to discuss in a minute. But, and especially the one terminology here is the tolerance. And we can talk about tolerance here all day within this context. But I'm not going to discuss whether these values are British or European or world values. I'm going to argue completely against these values. First of all, I need to say, why did these values emerged? Where did they come from? Why they are there? Because they have not emerged from nowhere. Because teachers have been teaching values over the years for centuries. But the specific values, fundamental British values, emerge under specific conditions. These conditions were created by attack in New York, 9/11, and following 9/11 declaration of war on terror, war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and its boomerang effect for the British community, 7/7 bombings in London. Fundamental British values emerge from these events. And also, I have personal stories for 9/11 and 7/7, because 9/11 is my first day of teaching in England. And I was going to school teaching, I was going to teach government and politics class in the UK, and this event happened. And 7/7, I was traveling to London for a conference, and this hotel I was staying was directly looking at this number 30 bus, which you can see that I put a photo here, that wreckage. I could see from my hotel room, that wreckage of bus and body. So they have personal stories as well. Now, where was first time this terminology or the definition of fundamental British values emerged? It emerged in a document which is nothing to do with education, which is my research area. It emerged in a document called Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. It's part of anti-terrorism law. It is the definition of extremism. According to Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2011, extremism is vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, which they are identified as democracy, the rule of law, and so on and so forth. So anyone who opposes or criticizes these values, they are identified as extremism in 2011. And why is it important for educators? And one might think is it is something to do with counterterrorism. What is it to do with educators? It is important for educators because in 2012, these values, the definition of these values entered into teachers' standard. What it means, all teachers has to follow these values, and they must not undermine fundamental British values in their schools, in their teachings. Following this, in 2015, a newly elected Conservative government under which they had big majority, they turned fundamental British values into a full law. So since 2015, promotion of fundamental British values in schools and colleges is law. Every teacher, every lecturer has to promote and not to undermine fundamental British values. What it means, this also has put some responsibilities on teachers. Teachers has to identify if they see someone as a suspect, if they see someone is opposing these values, they can be identified and referred to a specific organization, which is called de-radicalization organization. So teachers becoming a part of police force. In the beginning of the talk, I said I'm going to be arguing that these values and promotion of fundamental British values are racist. Why? That racism is not a static phenomenon. From the transatlantic slave trade to the Armenian genocide, to the Holocaust, to the present-day anti-Muslim racism, each epoch developed and identified its own alien or undesirable section of the community, then developed an ideology for justification of it. For example, Karl Marx observed racism during the development of modern capitalism by looking at the antagonism between Irish workers and native English workers in the 19th century in England. He showed how English discriminated Irish workers. Also, Edward Said's notion of other explored the construction of a binary relationship between the superior Occident and its opposition to the inferior Orient. This hegemonic relationship constructed the Occidental other in relation to European values and cultural codes. In the UK, since 1980s, cultural differences have become a smokescreen for racism and daily use of certain coded words such as illegal immigrant, bogus asylum seekers, extremists, Islamic extremism, and patriotism have replaced crude racist terms. And racist ideas have also been concealed behind intellectual discourses such as nationalism, European values, our way of life, and in France, laïcité, and in Germany, light culture or dominant culture, and Britain, fundamental British values. So it is not just in UK context, but in European context as well, Muslims and new racism and discriminations turn into culture.
Ümit Bey çok pardon, son 5 dakikamız lütfen ona göre.
Son 5 dakika. Oh,
evet, biraz hızlanmak.
Okay. Last 5 minutes, please, Ümit Bey. Please wrap up. Thank you.
I'll go very quickly now. In the UK, anti-Muslim racism also become respectable face of new racism. The media played a very important role. Media demonized and dehumanized Muslims and immigrants in Britain as describing them extremists, terrorists, so on and so forth. I'm going to move from media to directly the definition or what is the function of fundamental British values, last 6 minutes. The fundamental British values used in Britain, firstly, as a tool to identifying radicalization and extremism in schools. As part of it is the new Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, and it made teachers agents of the state security apparatus. And how did this happen? And I'm going to share a few numbers here. It is, I think, it's really important. Over the years, thousands of people was identified as extremists and terrorists. And I just want to focus on the 2016. In 2016, 7,631 people identified as extremists. And 65% of these were related to Islamic extremism. If you think about it, Muslims are only 5% of the British population. They make up the overwhelming majority of the people who were identified as extremists. What is the worrying aspect of it is 415 of those people were aged under 10, and the youngest one was 4 years old. How they were identified? Examples include like a Muslim teenager with Asian heritage in a North London school was identified as potential to requiring de-radicalization after using the term eco-terrorism in his French class. And after this, he was questioned about Islamic State and what he thinks about terrorism. Another example is a postgraduate student of counterterrorism who was falsely accused of being a terrorist after reading a book about terrorism entitled Terrorism Studies, which was part of his reading list. The most ridiculous one was a 4-year-old child was referred to anti-terrorism officers because he mispronounced cucumber. I mean, this is his drawing in school as he drew his father's cotton cucumber, his Greenberry's cucumber. I'm not going to discuss about his artistic skills, but so what was happening here, teachers interpreted his pronunciation of cucumber as cooking bomb, and he and his family referred to police because teachers thought his family is cooking bomb. This is 4-year-old child. And the second aspect of fundamental British values, how it is used, it promotes the notion of British values are essential element of Western civilization and they are superior in comparison to non-Western values. The British are regarded as the defenders and promoters of democracy, individual liberty, and respect around the world. This also dovetails the notion that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were concerned with spreading democracy. It means the promotion of fundamental British values is a means of othering and divisive policy, which implicitly and explicitly contributes to positive elevation of Britain's bloody colonial past. The colonial masters believe in their superiority over the colonized has been kept alive in the UK in different ways in social relations. The ontological superiority of being white is deeply entrenched in society, in British society, and the perception of the inferiority of Black and Asians is also present, not just in the day-to-day life, but at the top level of state institutions. For example, many MPs...
Son bir dakika Ümit Bey.
Tamam. Even Black MPs have been called the "Are you the new cleaner?" in British institutions. Very lastly, I'm just going to move very quickly. I'm going to quote Edward Said here, because Edward Said said, hostility to Islam in the modern Christian West has historically gone hand in hand with, has stemmed from the same source, has been nourished at the same stream as anti-Semitism. And it was clear from the media presentation. We can discuss this again, but I'm going to finish very quickly, what is to be done. What are the things what we are doing in the UK in order to challenge racism and in order to challenge what the environment created by promoting fundamental British values. First of all, as trade unionists and anti-racist campaigners, we are organizing the decolonized education curriculum. In order to do this, we are working with grassroots anti-racist organizations, student organizations, parents, and all the trade unions. Decolonizing curriculum means that not just curriculum, but we want to decolonize society. And most important part of decolonizing society is the showing solidarity with the oppressed groups and working with them. I'll stop here, and then hopefully we can discuss any other questions or issues later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ümit Bey. This was a very... useful presentation. I will move on to Ezgi Güner without further ado. Ezgi Güner has received her undergraduate degrees in cultural studies at Sabancı University. She continues her PhD anthropology with a minor in African studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her work explores the articulation of race and religion with global capitalism in the context of Turkey's contemporary relations with Africa south of the Sahara. She conducted multi-site ethnographic research in Turkey, Tanzania, Senegal, Gambia, and Benin. Güner was a visiting fellow at the anthropology department at Harvard University and Erasmus Fellow at the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz. I now would like to give the floor to Ezgi Güner for her presentation on changing meanings yet unchanging supremacy of whiteness in Turkey. You have the floor.
Say that I worked in the organization of Hrant Dink Memorial Workshops in the past as an assistant, and it's a great honor for me to return as a presenter today. In contemporary Turkey, there is a new investment in whiteness. A new racial formation, which I will call Muslim whiteness, has emerged under the AKP's hegemony. Whereas whiteness has historically been associated with secular modernization, over the last decade, it has become at the same time a marker of Islamic civility. This racial project has so far escaped academic scrutiny, I argue, because it came into being in Africa south of the Sahara. And Africa remains to this day marginal to the Turkish academia, at home and in the diaspora. When we look at the images presented here, they give us a sense of the different sites in which the Turk is racialized as white and African as black. The symbolism of the hand is important because it signifies the giving hand and the receiving hand. So racialization occurs in the context of an asymmetrical give and take, be it official development aid as in the image below, or of Islamic education in the left top, or Islamic charity in the form of humanitarian and medical aid as in the other two. I just want to make sure that you see my PowerPoint, right?
Yes.
Okay. The discourse of white Muslim is therefore crafted and circulated primarily in the context of humanitarian projects by faith-based NGOs and Islamic schooling by Sufi orders, which operate in tandem with Turkey's foreign policy in Africa. Before we move on, I would like to point at the representation of children, teenager, and adult hands in the pictures. Rather than engaging in acts of give and take, they are touching and holding each other, exhibiting physical and affective intimacy. In this racial regime, as we will see, Muslim whiteness is characterized and differentiated from other forms of whiteness by its capacity for interracial intimacy. Okay. So in this presentation, I will first analyze very briefly the historical trajectory of whiteness in Turkey, and then I will discuss how Africa provides a racial terrain in which Turkish whiteness acquires new meanings. As Murat Ergin has shown, the early Republican regime established a strong correlation between whiteness, modernity, and Western civilization, which lingers until today. In the early 20th century, skull measurement and pigmentation determined the ranking of a nation within the global hierarchies of savagery and civilization. In Turkey, the state allocated funds to physical anthropological research to prove the whiteness and hence the supremacy of the Turkish race. Students received state scholarships to study anthropology in Europe and America. One of these students was Afet İnan, Atatürk's adopted daughter. For her doctoral thesis under the supervision of the Swiss anthropologist Eugène Pitart, İnan conducted an anthropometric survey with 64,000 participants in Anatolia to show that Turks belonged to the Alpine race. The main objective of the scientific racism of the 1930s was to elevate the Turkish nation to the ranks of Western civilization. Although scientific racism lost its popularity in the aftermath of the Second World War, the racial construction of Turkish nationalism has remained intact, while the strong connection of whiteness to modernity and civility survived until today. We will see, however, that whiteness can be disarticulated from Western civilization and rearticulated instead with Ottoman Islamic civilization. The racial legacy of this state-led modernization became evident later in the century with the mobilization of color metaphors in public discourse. The neoliberalization unleashed by the 1980 military coup soon resulted in the deepening of economic inequalities and solidification of cultural hierarchies. multiple axes of social division became more visible than ever with the increased migration from rural areas to Istanbul and the informal housing that followed. Popular culture produced the racialized image of Maganda, representing the rural other, polluting the urban life. Maganda was a grotesque figure with dark skin, body odor, and a mustache. He was over-sexualized and dangerous. The antithesis of Maganda was the White Turk, who embodied the values of secular modernization, a westernized, secular, urban subject. Whiteness here indicated all the privileges that the newcomers lacked. Portrayed as young, handsome, light-skinned, and mustache-free, the White Turk symbolized the face of Turkey that deserved to become a member of the European Union. The identity of White Turk first emerged as a class-based social critique until it was appropriated by some media figures. The critical impetus of the White Turk label is not completely lost today. A rap song released in 2019 criticized the White Turk who drinks third wave coffee and only worries about his startup for his complicity with the authoritarian regime. With the rise of political Islam in the 1990s, the polarization between, that was a spoiler, okay. With the rise of political Islam in the 1990s, the polarization between secularists and Islamists was also articulated with the binary of white and black. While the White Turk symbolized the secularist establishment, the political leaders and media representing the Islamic movement appropriated the identity of Black Turk as a counter-hegemonic discourse. The self-claimed blackness of the leaders like Recep Kutan and Recep Tayyip Erdogan was a critical commentary about the repression of their parties by the secularist establishment. If the Black Turk was a counter-hegemonic discourse in the context of the 1990s, as Tanıl Bora reminds us, today it has become a discursive strategy in the maintenance of the AKP's hegemony. More recently, then the Prime Minister Erdogan identified himself as a Black Turk during the Gezi protests in 2013, morally justifying police violence with an outdated claim of symbolic violence. Assimilated into AKP's identity politics, the binary of white and black is divorced from its critical potential, as Sedef Arat Koç argues. I should add that the reification of the categories of white and black Turk by scholars and journalists, as you can see here with Der Spiegel, contributes to this process. So if the White Turk is the national symbol of power and privilege, the white man has been its global counterpart for the Islamist critiques of Western hegemony. An important point of reference in the genealogy of the critique of whiteness by the Islamic movement has been the figure of the Native American. Leaders of the movement like Necmettin Erbakan and Ahmet Davutoğlu referred to the indigenous critiques of the white man at different times as the embodiment of settler colonialism and Western imperialism. President Erdogan cited a Native American proverb in two different international meetings organized by the United Nations in Istanbul in 2011 and 2013. The Turkish rendition of the proverb, "When the last river drains out, the last tree is destroyed, the last fish dies, the white man will realize that money cannot be eaten," gives a name, the white man, to the object of the critique, which is actually missing from the original. So the following questions beg for answer. If the white man is the plunderer of natural resources and the perpetrator of genocidal violence, what makes whiteness so desirable? If achieving whiteness was an objective of the Kemalist modernization project, then on what grounds is it appropriated today by its strongest critiques? How is whiteness dissociated from Western civilization and associated instead with Muslim identity and Islamic civility in contemporary Turkey? In short, how does the Black Turk become the white Muslim? Before moving to the redefinition of whiteness in Africa south of the Sahara, I would like to mention a critical moment in transitioning from blackness to whiteness. In 2013, the Turkish Coordination and Cooperation Agency, TICA, donated $200,000 to a Native American tribe in the United States as development aid. This picture shows the leaders of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs receiving the check at the Turkish embassy. With this symbolic gesture, we can say Turkey inaugurated its emergence on the world stage as the new white man. The racist headline of a pro-government newspaper, "Thanks from Redskins to the White Man Turkey," makes this transition clear. Whiteness, it seems, has something to do with giving, and giving with power for sure. This moment also marks the bifurcation of whiteness into good whites, i.e. Turkish Muslim whiteness, and bad whites, European colonizers and their descendants. In the post-Cold War humanitarian order, sovereignty is reconceptualized as the moral responsibility to intervene. The global mapping of sovereignty and suffering is in itself a racial configuration. As a strategy of power, race produces humanitarian subjects and suffering subjects at the same time. Whiteness thus marks the position of the philanthropist, the humanitarian who is entitled to intervene. And aiding the Native American in that sense was a conspicuous performance of sovereignty which whitened oneself. It is in the context of global humanitarian governmentality, more specifically during the 2005 Niger food crisis, that Turkey emerged not only as a new donor in Africa, but as a committed member of the international community by donating $1.8 million to the United Nations World Food Programme. In the wake of the 2011 Somalia famine, Turkey consolidated its position as a humanitarian state with a $400 million in official aid. During the month of Ramadan, Prime Minister Erdogan visited the country along with his family, cabinet members, businessmen, and artists like Ajda Pekkan, Sertab Erener, and Muazzez Ersoy, to the surprise of the Turkish public. If there was an iconic figure of the white Turk in Turkish pop music and cinema, it was Ajda Pekkan. This was not due to her blonde hair and light skin only. In music, she represented the Western and cosmopolitan, as opposed to the provincial and folk. On screen, her beauty combined whiteness with goodness and innocence. The Prime Minister's 2011 visit marked also the beginning of the Turkish presence in the post-conflict reconstruction of Somalia by paving the way for the Turkish contractors to build roads, schools, hospitals, and mosques, and to operate ports and airports. Africa thus provides a racial terrain in which the binary of white and Turk as symbols of political, economic, and social inequality in Turkey can be reversed after being recycled as phenotypical qualities. This phenotypical value is then converted into economic value. After all, whiteness is not limited to philanthropy and humanitarianism. It stands at the same time for modernity, development, technological advancement, and technical know-how. It is the lubricant of global capitalism. Okay. So since 2011, dozens of faith-based NGOs ranging from small-scale local associations to nationwide foundations have provided aid in sub-Saharan countries. These took the form of drilling water wells and constructing mosques, sacrificing animal and distributing livestock, building solar energy infrastructure and community gardens, organizing medical camps and circumcision operations.
Son 5 dakikamız.
Tamam, bitiyor. Establishing Islamic schools and distributing Quran, as well as sponsoring orphans. Here you see the pictures I copied from Dr. Banu Çiftçi's Instagram account, which has almost 700,000 followers. Dr. Banu regularly volunteers for medical camps organized in different countries in Africa south of the Sahara. Besides, she herself sponsored water wells and collected donations through her social media account for the construction of several others. As a gynecologist, she usually posts pictures with newborn babies of Turkish families and occasionally with African children from her medical camps. These pictures taken in rural Africa present a stark contrast to the sterile environment and high technology of the private hospital Dr. Banu works for. Gamze Özçelik, a former model who recently surprised her fans by covering her hair, is maybe the most popular Turkish humanitarian volunteer in this context. In her pictures with African children, she appears as the perfect embodiment of the values of Muslim whiteness. Her gendered performance combines whiteness as an aesthetic value with Islamic conceptions of female modesty, care, and interracial intimacy. Finally, I would like to turn to Sevda Sevan, who received the 2018 International Benevolence Award from the Diyanet Foundation, attached to the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Unlike others, Sevda is not an occasional volunteer. Rather, she devoted her life to developing agricultural, humanitarian, and educational projects in Tanzania. She also differentiates from other humanitarians I discussed by actually living in rural Tanzania. The award she received from the Diyanet reflects the state's support behind Islamic humanitarianism in Africa, It also makes a statement about the ideal citizen of the current regime. The white Muslim, who continues to embody the whiteness and modernity idealized by the Republican regime, yet does so not within the civilizational boundaries of the West, but of Islam. In Africa south of the Sahara, the Turkish Muslim is reborn as the new white man. This racial rebirth entails the transformation of the Black Turk into the white Muslim, mirroring the shift of the Islamic movement from counter-hegemonic position to a hegemonic one in Turkish politics. As the AKP's new Turkey turns away from Western civilization towards an Ottoman Islamic civilization, the previously Black Turks become white Muslims. When I say Africa provides a racial terrain that enables this transformation, I do not simply mean that Blackness operates as a foil against which phenotypical whiteness can be claimed. Rather, the new humanitarian order is built upon the persistent legacies of earlier racial order. Through humanitarian interventions, Turkey is negotiating its position within the post-Cold War order. Therefore, appropriating whiteness as the new racial code of Islamic civility is to claim a hegemonic position in a world structured by global white supremacy, and not a counter-hegemonic one as the official and mainstream discourse on Africa suggests in Turkey. Thank you.
Big thank you to Özgür Güner. This has been a very good complementary presentation upon the first one we heard from our first speaker. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions to both panelists, but I think that in the strengthening of racism and prejudice and things like that, that there is a principle, some sort of principle of mutuality, reciprocity, and the sense of supremacy experienced by one nation can be adopted by other nations. And the arrogance of the West can be carried over and transferred to the Eastern world, so to speak, at different levels.